Our next guest has been reporting on Wall Street malfeasance and the prosecutions or lack thereof for some time. I have followed his work for some time. Jesse Eisinger is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and he is a senior reporter at ProPublica. He is also the author of a new book whose title is not pronounceable on broadcast radio or television, but could loosely be translated as the Chicken Poop Club. Subtitle, Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives. And he joins us now. First of all, Jesse, thank you for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me, Richard. The title gets so many different versions on these interviews. I hope the readers and listeners know what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think they do. I think we can be pretty comfortable that when somebody talks about chicken, they know how the word is finished. And so, okay, so let's start with that rather inevitable question then, as long as we're on the subject. Where does that phrase come from? Where does that title come from?
Yes, well, you'd be surprised to learn that it did not come from my daughters, who turned out to be huge fans of the title, which they're 8 and 4, so this has made my wife less of a fan. But it actually comes from Jim Comey. Before he was fired as FBI director by Donald Trump, long before, 15 years ago, he was the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. And he came in and did a speech to the young hotshot prosecutors. And the Southern District of New York is really the best of the best trial attorneys in the country. And he said, how many of you have never lost a case? And a bunch of hands shoot up because they're really proud of their records. And he said, well, me and my buddies have a name for you guys. You are the Chicken Bleep Club. And what he meant by that was, you are not about winning, certainly not at winning at all costs or making an undefeated record. What you guys jobs are to do is justice. And justice requires ambitious cases, not taking on the low-hanging fruit or beating people up. And if you can't take on the most powerful operators who are doing bad things, you're not doing your jobs.
You know, I think that's a great point, and I think the corollary to that is it could be argued anyway, Jesse Eisinger, that if you're not losing any prosecutions as a DA or a prosecutor, you're not taking any chances. Maybe that was part of Comey's point too, that if you lose a few, okay, you're reaching, but the point is, and you know, I've written somewhat on Wall Street and the lack of prosecutions myself, and what always struck me about the public debate that you'd see played out in the New York Times and elsewhere, is the posture of a lot of prosecutors, a lot of Justice Department officials seem to be, well, you know, it's really hard to get a conviction for a crime of type A or type B, or they're complicated cases or whatever. There would seem to be an undercurrent, well, multiple undercurrents. One of the undercurrents seemed to be, you know, I don't really want to try and fail.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they're very worried about failure, and they're worried for their failure because of their resumes. And you're absolutely right that sometimes you have to take a case and take it to a jury, and sometimes juries will bring back a verdict that is against you if you're a prosecutor, because juries are unpredictable. Human beings are unpredictable, but there's a service provided by airing evidence, and the flip side of this, or the consequences of this, are that we give a certain class of people in this country a pass from trials. The wealthy and the powerful, if you're sitting at a corporation, you don't have to go to trial. You do not have to be charged. You have impunity to commit corporate crimes. And, you know, we have mass incarceration in this country. We have a problem where one class of people, disproportionately poor, disproportionately of color, are punished punitively, and another class is not punished at all. And it's unjust and unfair, and I think the public knows it.
Well, you know, there's that famous story of Teddy Roosevelt when he was first president, moving aggressively to break up the trusts and so on, and having J.P. Morgan supposedly say to him, I don't understand what's wrong. If there's a problem, I'll send my man around to your man and they'll work it out. Have we gone back to that now? Is it the case where if banks are engaged even in massive, large-scale fraud, executives know they don't have to fear prosecution, they'll just send their person around to the government's person and it will all be worked out?
I think it's a little subtler than that. I think that most bankers are honest people trying to not break the law. And in a couple of cases, the laws are a little bit ambiguous. But I think what we have seen, what we have evidence for, is that the banks, and this is not just a case of the banks, this is large companies, have responded repeatedly by settling with the government over and over again for wrongdoing and criminal wrongdoing and also civil wrongdoing. Then they're recidivists. And you see this with Pfizer or JP Morgan and many, many other companies where they enter into settlements over and over again for bad behavior. And so the government clearly is not changing these cultures. They're clearly not sending a message that is getting through to these companies that they have to police themselves much better. In fact, it's the opposite. I think that these fines come out of shareholder pockets and are a cost of doing business. And the true accountability would come when you put individual executives in prison. That would send a message.
Yes, it certainly would. And again, we're talking with Jesse Eisinger, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and the author of the new book, The Chicken Bleep Club, Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives. You know, you had not so long ago the president of one of the Federal Reserve banks, and I'm blanking on which one, whether it was Dudley or Fisher, but, you know, someone who is not a radical or a lefty or a rock thrower by any means, a couple years ago gave a very powerful speech about, you know, what he characterized pretty much as a culture of corruption in the banks that isn't likely to change without certain changes in incentive structures and things like that. But aren't we talking in effect about preserving a culture? You talk about, you know, J.P. Morgan Chase has multiple offenses. Most of the big banks have had multiple offenses. You know, foreclosure fraud, the Burger King kids, as they call them at J.P. Morgan Chase's job was to generate massive documents relating to mortgages that were not properly sourced and so on. Aren't we really talking about a cultural problem that maybe A, includes the large chunks of the banking industry, and B, even extends to the prosecutorial world? Or am I being too tough?
That was Bill Dudley, who's the New York Fed head chairman, who raised that problem, and I think he was absolutely right. There is a culture, rotten culture, and even the decent bankers are pressured into cutting corners and taking advantage of customers because there's so much pressure to make money, and the money, the personal compensation is so great. And then the real problem is that the prosecutors don't have the incentives to really look at individuals, and as I say, holding individuals accountable is really the way to cure the rot in the system, because I think white-collar people have a stake in society. They care about their reputations. They pay attention to the news, and if you put a few in prison, you would have great deterrent effects, unlike fines that are paid out of shareholder pockets, which I do not think deter crime in any significant way. The problem is that the prosecutors are, by and large, young people whose bosses have the wrong incentives, and the individual staff attorneys have the wrong incentives. They have the incentives to work on settlements which they can accomplish and have on their resumes, and they're not taking the risk of working for years and years, 3 years, 4 years, and trying to bring one of these people to trial against the best defense lawyers in the country and then losing. And if you've lost, then you have nothing to put on your resume. It's too great a risk. So their bosses need to give them the incentives to do this, but their bosses revolve in and out of big law. Right. So you've got Eric Holder and Lanny Brewer, two of Obama's top Department of Justice officials, both coming from Covington and Burling. Mary Jo White, his head of the SEC, came from Debevoise and Plimpton. And they go back to these law firms. And if they're doing that one day they're representing corporations, the other day they're supposed to police them, and the next day they're back to representing them. It's just too impossible to actually have a culture of justice and strong enforcement.
You know, I think that's such an important point. I think the revolving door is critical to all of this, Jesse Eisinger. But I also think, I think it's interesting to consider the political dimension to all this too, and the social dimension. Meaning if you're Barack Obama or you're a senator of either party, you're raising money from the very people that you might be asking your attorney general someday to direct a criminal investigation against. So, I mean, I think, isn't part of it there's the obvious question of, well, what does it do to fundraising if politicians encourage their prosecutors to go after these folks? But isn't there also kind of a cocktail party dimension to the problem where it's like, I have drinks with Jamie Dimon at J.P. Morgan Chase or Brian Moynihan at Bank of America? It's just not, it doesn't feel right to then say, well, I might be investigating them, or they're lieutenants or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think, I call it sort of class affinity problem. Mm-hmm. These people consider Goldman Sachs executives and top executives, they're very well educated. They went to the same schools. They're articulate, they're thoughtful, they're cultured. And it's very hard for the people at the SEC and the DOJ to see these people as criminals. In fact, when they were investigating Goldman Sachs over what I consider to be serious wrongdoing in the mortgage securities market, one SEC guy, I uncovered this email and it's in the book, said, well, we have to remember that these are good people who made one mistake. And that's the pervasive attitude among prosecutors and regulators, that these people are essentially good at heart, who may occasionally make one mistake, but they make mistakes over and over again. And it turns out, I don't think that they are mistakes. They're systematically ripping off their customers and misleading the public. And so they have to break this attitude. And I think you're absolutely right that the attitude goes all the way to the top and has, and certainly is because they're, especially Democrats now, have switched their funding sources from labor and a variety of other places to corporations, just like the Republicans. So now the corporations have an ear to both parties, and that has absolutely affected the way we enforce the laws.
Yeah, so a lot of people like to make the comparison that in the much smaller savings and loan scandal of the 80s, there were 1,000 prosecutions, and in this larger scandal, there have been very few, essentially none of senior executives. So Jesse Eisinger, I guess, for the vast majority of the time you've been doing your own reporting on this issue and writing this book, we were working with a Democratic administration, a Democratic attorney general, and so on. Now we have Donald Trump in, and strikes me that the sort of resentment of the white glove treatment given to bankers may have helped Trump a little bit, but now Trump is in, and in your own reporting, are you seeing any kind of difference in tone? I mean, he's picked all sorts of Goldman Sachs people to staff his own administration.
No, I mean, sadly, it was a con, and I have been very critical of the Eric Holder regime, and sadly, I think that the Jeff Sessions DOJ is going to be the worst of our lifetimes, and I think they are only going to get much softer on corporate crime. In general, I think we can't even imagine how generous they are going to be to, and how much they're going to look away from corporate criminals. We haven't seen a lot of it yet. It's a little too early to really see the changes in the DOJ in their approach to white-collar crime, but it bodes ill. I think that the Sessions DOJ is going to focus on bringing back punitive sentences for drug offenses and nonviolent crimes and street crime and neglect white-collar crime. So it bodes very ill.
So if you're a street user of drugs, it's going to be bad for you, but if you're the modern-day equivalent of Wachovia laundering drug dealers money from Mexico, you may be in for an even smoother ride than before. Is that what you're telling us?
I unfortunately, I have a lot of heroes in my book, and I hope their stories are compelling and interesting. But they're thwarted, and it's a book that doesn't have a happy ending. I'm sad to say.
Well, not yet. But
Not yet.
I like to think positively. So Jesse Eisinger, author of the book, The Chicken Bleep Club, Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives. Thanks for the great reporting, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.